Hey, Cecily.
What's up, Tim?
We watched the Netflix show Daybreak for the podcast, which is a mix of the teenage adventure aspects of Ferris Bueller's Day Off and the depressing nuclear war story of The Day After. I guess we can finally say that we learned what happened the day after Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear nonproliferation for a living, and I'm thrilled today to be joined on the podcast over Zoom with Cecili Thompson-Williams, Executive Director of Beyond the Bomb, which is a grassroots organization that encourages people at the local, state, and national levels to envision a world where we have moved beyond needing or wanting nuclear weapons, and most importantly, then taking the steps to bring that world into a reality. Welcome to the podcast, and is that an accurate description of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's right on. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Terrific. Well, before we get into the purpose of our podcast to talk about the Netflix show Daybreak, what are some of the policy priorities of Beyond the Bomb for people who may not have been familiar with your organization yet?
Sure. So our long-term goal is to build a world without nukes, and we want that world to also have addressed the destructive legacy of nuclear weapons. So our primary area of policy focus to get there is called no first use. So that's the policy that says that we shouldn't start a nuclear war. It's pretty straightforward. We don't think that we should be striking first with nukes, or anyone should be striking first with nukes. No one does it first. No one does it. So that's where we focus most of our energy here on domestic policy. But we also work on a variety of other nuclear policies and related issues. So we work on legislation, for example, to add protections for communities that have been impacted by the U.S.'s nuclear legacy. We're working on New START extension, so making sure that we still have at least one treaty guardrail in place to prevent a new arms race. And we work in partnership with a lot of different organizations, both in the nuke space and outside, to raise the profile of the issue.
That's terrific. Yeah, that sounds a lot of the different kinds of strategies that you're involved. I know you do a lot of, it's all 2020 was a large part of your goals is for a lot more bringing this to Congress, a lot of grassroots efforts, a lot of letter writing, a lot of showing up to campaigns and making sure that these things are asked to the candidates, because it doesn't pop up all that much in the presidential primary debates. I think one question got asked early on about nukes, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah, we've had a couple questions in the debates. One that was actually a relatively decent question, but you're right, it's not in the public eye as much as it needs to be. So we do, our main focus is field organizing, partnerships, working with other organizations, and then digital outreach, right? We want to get the message out there. We want to get people outraged and active. And then we want to connect them both with our actions and with other movements that are doing related work to build a comprehensive, sane nuclear policy system here in the U.S.
Okay, well, right at the very top of this, how has pop culture and the way that nukes are portrayed in movies and TV, how has that helped or hurt your efforts at trying to make sure people understand this is a problem and maybe they should consider doing something about it on their own?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, the first thing I'll say is I think that pop culture is really critical to any kind of campaigning. So I'm super excited, one, that the show that you're doing exists, two, that we do see nukes in pop culture every so often. I think it's really a critical piece of how we get people engaged and excited is if they see it in the places where they're going to, spend their off time. That being said, I think, the way that nukes are portrayed can be challenging. So we've seen in some shows or games, they kind of downplay or make too light of the destructive power of nukes. And that has the potential to really hurt the cause because it makes the public think that, this isn't really a true existential crisis anymore, that this is sort of a bygone issue and we don't need to be worried about it today.
You selected this show, Daybreak, for us to cover today. So I want to ask you later on kind of how you came across this show and why did you want to recommend it? But it really did end up being a good example of this because it is nukes in that show, kind of a plot point at some points, and other points it's like, it's just something that led into it. And before we get into it here, for anyone who's not familiar with this is a 10-episode arc on Netflix. They did one season and then it got canceled. So it was released in 2019. It's a story of where nuclear war breaks out in Glendale, California, and somehow that zombifies the adults and leaves the high school students living out a Mad Max situation. How did you come across this show and end up recommending it? I'm a Netflix person. I think I might have saw the trailer, but I don't think I picked up that it was nuclear. I think I just saw, zombies and teenagers. I've seen some of those. What's on next?
I think I have a very unique algorithm at play on the Netflix in my house. I have a 16-year-old daughter, so I get that kind of influence. I have a 10-year-old daughter who's really into like sciencey kind of investigative type shows for kids. And then I, of course, as you know, a nuclear advocate, spend a lot of time watching post-apocalyptic shows. And so the recommendations I get are kind of wacky. And Daybreak was like front and center one time. And also, of course, Ferris Bueller is like one of my favorites. And so I think Netflix actually was pretty right on in recommending this for me. It fits pretty nicely with a lot of, my work and my home.
Well, that's terrific. After watching all 10 of these, I'm starting to get some of these other adjacent teenage movies kind of brought into my algorithm. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, so this was based on a 2013 comic by Brian Ralph, and it was created by people like Brad Payton, who mostly has been known for making movies with The Rock, like Rampage and San Andreas, and as well as someone, Aaron Eli Coletti, who wrote the TV show Heroes, which was a good show back in those days. And as you mentioned, Ferris Bueller, Matthew Broderick's in this. He plays the principal, and then we'll spoil a little bit later, another main big character near the end of the show, and then a host of other young actors, because I am not a teenager and I don't know who any of these people are, so it definitely made me feel old, but it was fun to see some new people, because some of them were pretty good in the show. The reception of the show, as we mentioned, it was canceled after one season, but it got a 70% in Rotten Tomatoes, which is, not too bad for a Netflix show like this. Before we get into the plot of it and then start talking about some of the interesting nuclear questions and themes that are in the show, what was your kind of overall impression of the show? It's 10 episodes, so that's in these, well, maybe before quarantine, that was a huge commitment of time.
I think my overall impression was it was just shy of the mark for almost all of its potential audiences. So my 16-year-old did not like it.
Okay. And
I feel like she's like the target audience. I, as a post-apocalyptic TV show junkie, it was okay. It wasn't great. So like that, it sort of missed the mark there. And I think if you're like a fan of comedies, and particularly like coming of age comedies, it probably didn't hit the mark for you either. So I feel like it was just shy of, so 70% seems right to me, but that you would sort of be like, it's okay. Yeah.
If you get a 70% on a test, you're not going to get kicked out of school, but you're probably not going to take an AP class or something. This is a good start, I think, to this. So let's get into the conversation of the TV show itself. As usual, spoiler warning, if you haven't seen this 10-episode series yet, you can go ahead and do that on Netflix now, or you can just listen to us and we'll provide a pretty good overview of this.
Hey bros, what does the golf team do to those who crash our party?
Take another step and you're dead.
Well, loser! Is this what you were trying to do?
I was trying to cut it clean off. It was gonna be rad.
That's me, Josh, and I've got a killer origin story.
It's got fights, drama,
Josh, this is Sam.
and love.
You're challenging, Josh Wheeler, and I do like a challenge.
But then, this happened.
Oh man, goddamn, hell broke loose.
So what's life like during the apocalypse?
Brace yourself, I take you on a trip down memory lane.
It's awesome. There's no rules left because adults turn into what we call ghoulies.
The world is backwards. I just fit in way better now.
Sure, there are still jocks, nerds, and cheerleaders,
City go against me.
but I have everything I ever wanted.
But it's not about having cool shit. It's about being cool as shit.
Sam is out there, and I'm not giving up until I find her.
You can't just leave us.
I agree with the petulant dwarf. You acquire our assistance.
We're making something important here. Our own tribe. A family by choice.
So what's life like in the apocalypse?
It's never what you'd expect.
So the show jumps around a lot. That's one of the things I liked about the show a lot. It jumps around on who it's going to focus on in terms of either our heroes and our villains in each episode. It really keeps you guessing about what you're going to see in the next episode. And I really like that particular formula. It started out as like a very much a fourth wall breaking Ferris Bueller type discussion of this guy Josh, who's the main character, his life before and after World War III. And then other episodes are like, sometimes they integrate cartoons, sometimes they integrate this like traditional Japanese martial arts movie vibe. I think one of them is even narrated by RZA from Wu-Tang Clan. So that was very entertaining. So I enjoyed that part of it as well. Did you enjoy that piece of the way they broke that out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that was really interesting about it was that, as you said, you didn't know what you were going to get on any given episode, and it was specific to the nature of that specific episode story or those characters, how it was told. So they've positioned Josh as this sort of Ferris Bueller type character, and so that's sort of what surrounds him. But then other characters really integrate better with other types and styles, and so pulling those in felt really appropriate.
Yeah, Josh is he is a Canadian who moves to Glendale. He's in the course of the show, once the bombs drop, he's looking for his girlfriend Sam Dean. He is one who announces pretty early in the show he actually doesn't mind all that much the end of the world, because it allows him to kind of really lean into his lone survivor type personality. He walks around with a samurai sword and a skateboard, and just living life on the Mad Max Fury Road. Sam is this popular student, I think maybe a British exchange student or someone who was his family moved there. She survived the bombs, but she's missing at the beginning of the show. There's this character Angelica. She's a brash 10-year-old who's really smart, but kind of a little bit crazy in terms of how she applies those smarts. So hopefully that's not how your 10-year-old is like, but maybe a little bit. Okay. Then we get two other characters that I worth mentioning at this point, the kids. You got Wesley Fisk, a great name for a guy who takes on like a Ronin samurai type persona. He's trying to move on from his past as being a jock bully in the former life before the bombs. And then we got another guy, Turbo Bro Jock Polowski, who is kind of like the guy in Mad Max Road Warrior, the second one, the guy with the hockey mask, but he's a former jock who now rules with an iron fist over a group of athletes who are now taking over the world. And then there's two other characters, right? You want to talk about some of the two adult characters that are in the show?
Absolutely. So Miss Crumble is my absolute favorite character in the show. So she's the high school biology teacher who is lucky enough to not be turned either into goop or a full-on zombie after the bombs fell somehow, but she is going a little nuts. And so it's, watching her kind of transformation and trying to hang on to her identity is amazing. Then the second one is Michael Burr, who's the high school principal, and he seems like he really wants the students to do well, but behind the scenes maybe he's a little bit nuts, as everyone seems to be in one way or another in the show.
He has a running concern about peanut allergies. It's kind of a plot point that I'm like, oh, okay, was this going to be a thing? And then eventually it wasn't at the very end. But yeah, he definitely, Matthew Broderick in this, he is the principal. He is really leaning into his all the goodwill that you may have gotten from Ferris Bueller. And it's just so funny now that it's an obvious joke, but now he is the principal trying to deal with students that are causing mischief as opposed to the other way around. I like that. That was a fun little thing to play off of.
Totally. And one of the things I loved about that actually was that, to me, that was one of the funniest parts of the show. And for my 16-year-old, it went completely over her head. She did not get any of those Ferris. She's seen it, but it wasn't a part of her consciousness. So she didn't get any of the Ferris Bueller references, which I think takes a lot away from the quality of the show, which again is a little bit of how the mark was missed.
It definitely seems like one of those shows where it's trying to reach an audience of people who were into the 80s and now are wanting that nostalgia, but it's written in the language of a show that you would only show to someone who was maybe born in the 2000s. So it's a very weird kind of mix they're trying to get there.
Yep, exactly.
So the overall plot of the show, right? Sam and Josh get set up by the principal because Josh is having trouble fitting in. So she helps the students essentially kind of escort them around, get them connected, try to make sure that they get on the right foot when they join the school. But it turns out they hit it off romantically. It's kind of a usual story you would get with a rom-com and a high school rom-com. But then, of course, it's interrupted about halfway through with some nuclear detonations that destroy the world and ruin homecoming. Josh hints that it was a tweet that started the war. There's little quotes here and there from little dictators with big egos. Well, they can launch a nuke with a tweet. And he says at one point that adults blew up the world, not us. Let's get into, before we get into the rest of the plot stuff, I always like to talk about the imagery that we get in the content that we're talking about of the bombs themselves. What did you think about kind of first of all, the the scenes that we do get, which are all flashbacks, because we start the show after, I don't know how long, couple weeks maybe after it happened, and then we then get into lots of flashbacks of scene when it does occur. I think usually the bomb went off like in the middle of night during a homecoming football game or something like that.
Yeah, so I do think that they did a good job showing off the explosions, the mushroom clouds, the shock waves. I mean, I think that they didn't really tone that down, right? It was destructive. It showed the power of the weapons. It was more in the sort of aftermath that they didn't do a great job showing what would happen. But I do think the sort of scale and overwhelmingness of the bomb itself, they did a pretty good job with.
Yeah, they showed a couple of the things. They showed heat. They showed shockwaves. They hinted at radiation issues, but the kind of interesting spin here, and I'm not sure if this is what they meant, they were going for beyond the bomb here, but the interesting spin that they added beyond the traditional nukes and what they do is these can turn people and adults. So I guess at some point there's an age cutoff. I'm not sure if it's 19 or 20 or something, but adults either become goo, so they disappear, or they become essentially mindless zombies repeating and doing the last activity they were doing before the bomb went off. But we also get our classic radiation-induced large monsters, like I think it was a large pug dog at one point, some large rats, some large crows with 3 or 4 different sets of eyes. So we get that, because we can't have a nuke movie without those things, apparently.
Well, and I also think that what they did with the adults was brilliant, right? So, I mean, essentially the adults are walking around literally saying the last stupid thing that they were thinking, but they're also super dangerous to the youth that have survived, right? So, like, if you're an adult, they're, like, walking around talking about how they need to, like, text their babysitter, or, oh, I should have gotten the extra smoothie at the gym, or, like, just really inane, stupid stuff. But at the same time, they have the power to basically like wipe out all of these kids. To me, that is such a great representation of where we are in the US right now. Well, at this particular moment, really, because of COVID, but just sort of generally with our system, where you have all these adults who sort of are clueless, but because of that cluelessness, they are bringing about more of this existential crisis for the next generation.
This is something that it's become more of a thing since we watched the show, but like, you know, you see the protests about the stay-at-home orders and people talking about wanting to get a haircut. That is something you would see one of the zombies say in this. Right before they tried to attack you, they would say, I need to get a haircut. Need to get my haircut.
Exactly.
Fascinating. And the one thing they don't really get into too much in the show is any sort of lingering radiation or fallout from the bombs. At some points, it looks like an entire area, a couple of square blocks are like destroyed because of the bomb. Other times, everything seems to be roughly fine. Which I guess could be okay because you have to have locations to film, and maybe you can't have your teen stars with their hair falling out and their teeth falling out and everything because of radiation. But it's a balance, I think, that they didn't really do all that well if they were trying to go for the other stuff, but it was fine for the purposes of, I guess, the other areas where they may want to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have been really hard for them to have the teens, because the point of the story is to show how the kids are dealing with this world where they're all of a sudden in charge because they're the only ones there. It's really hard to both tell that story and have them all be super sick. At the same time, again, from an advocacy standpoint, it would be helpful for people to understand that the aftermath of nukes it's not just who's impacted at that specific moment, but the sort of long-term implications for how you deal with everyone who survives and what survival actually means for their health.
Right. If you want to watch teenagers dealing with nuclear war, you can watch Threads. If you really want to get into that, I guess this is one of the things I was trying to figure out is, does the nuclear war and weapons in this particular show make the world seem a little less dangerous and kind of silly, or does it show that, hey, these things are possible? But anyways, it's fascinating. It's also fascinating from a plot perspective that they combine the nukes into this interesting nuclear radiological concern, but also a biological concern. Not too many movies I've seen that have done that, but they add that extra element there, that the weapons, whether they were Russian or Chinese or something, were somehow also added. They were spiced, they were salted, I guess, to make it a little more dangerous with radiological and biological damages. Fascinating. It's an interesting little twist there.
Totally. And I loved how, part of it was that the kids just didn't really know what to expect and what would be in in a weapon like this. Like, all of it is a surprise, right?
Right.
And I think that that's really representative of where we are now, that there's this sort of like amorphous fear of something, but we don't know exactly what, when, how, what it would look like. And so you've got these, this whole generation that's kind of growing up thinking like, are we on the precipice of the end of the world, but we don't know how it's going to hit us. So to me, that sort of all these things wrapped up together, and they said at points talked about climate change, things like that, made a lot of sense, right? Because it is this sort of threat, and the fact that adults were a part of that threat after the fact and become these zombies essentially, that's all really relevant as well. So I was actually excited to see a show that helps youth identify, like helps teens identify that nukes and all these other things are existential threats that we need to do something about. And specifically, unfortunately, they need to do something about.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the very end of the show, you get a couple of adults that now try to use the weapons again for their next round of ulterior motives. But for most of the time, it's just, well, what are the kids going to have to deal with this? Because the adults are either zombies, which you could argue maybe they were before if they weren't doing anything about the nuclear concerns, or they're goo, which is what you may end up being, probably more vaporized goo at some point. So I think that is an interesting piece that they put into this. But of course, that's not the only thing that the show deals with. Whatever the nukes happen to be, we get the plot of the show, which is a few months later, Glendale, which is about 10 minutes from where I grew up on the freeway, with no traffic or anything. So it was fun to see locations and stuff, and what it would look like if it was bombed out. The mall was definitely a piece of my late 90s, early 2000s childhood. So that was pretty cool to see. So we get the different groups that are now ruling over the kingdoms of Glendale, which was fun. They're different social cliques. So we get the jocks, they're pretty much the muscle, the ones in charge. We get the cheermasons. We've got the disciples of Kardashian, which I guess are like the fashion Kardashian family followers. We have the 4-H club, which the 4-H club I've always seen references to that wasn't actually on my high school. I don't know if your high school had a 4-H like farming club.
We did not.
It's always something that's referenced, but I never have really seen it. But farming's big in our area. Like the Chino area, which is next to Glendale-ish, has a lot of farms and things. So maybe it's there, I just didn't see it. We've got the STEM punks, the science guys. We've got the Game Over gaming crew. And then my personal favorite, the golf team and their ever-dwindling membership, because every couple episodes, one of the golf team members dies, and they have to find a way to replace them, but they don't. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Whenever our main characters aren't being harassed by one of these groups, or the ghoulies, the kind of zombie people, we get this other character, the mysterious Baron Triumph, who's like a gas mask wearing, motorcycle driving cannibal that everybody is concerned with. But yeah, that's kind of the premise of the show. You can talk all kinds of detail about this, but the big thing is that Wesley meets up with Angelica, the young girl, and then Wesley, the former jock who's now a samurai, and they kind of go and hole up in a mall, kind of like the movie Dawn of the Dead, which is another kind of fascinating reference for this. You want to talk a little bit about some of the other parts of the plots before we get into the kind of the big finale here with the radiation bits?
Sure. So as things move forward, you have Josh feuding with the jocks because they've held Sam, who's girlfriend, prisoner. Got Wesley, who is a former lover of the head jock. So the head jock is the sort of bad dude who rules over everybody, I think you said, with a baseball glove clad fist. And so Wesley's struggling with his love for Turbo, who turns out to be a bad guy, it seems, and a desire to become a better person than Turbo wants to be in that world. Angelica, again, the 10-year-old, who's wise beyond her years, seeks friendship and a place for herself, and she tries to bring Miss Crumble, and my favorite character, who is a teacher, back from being a semi-zombie human hybrid. So Miss Crumble doesn't get fully zombified, and there's a flicker of herself inside, and so Angelica is trying to bring her back because Angelica's mom is MIA on a submarine somewhere, which I thought was also kind of interesting take on it. Her mom is more dedicated to her career than she is to Angelica, and here she is to fend for herself. And then it turns out that Baron Triumph, this super bad dude on a motorcycle who's scaring everybody all around town, is actually Principal Burr, again from Ferris Bueller fame, Matthew Broderick, who survived in his school's fallout shelter and now wants to either eat bad children or impose strict discipline on them to rule the new world. Very interesting combination of modes of punishment for bad kids. And yeah, that is our big reveal moment.
It was fun. I mean, I don't know if there was a certain point where I'm like, it's probably the principal, because why would you have Matthew Broderick in this show and only for a few episodes? But it was still fun for him to play that character. He was really good in it. He's fun.
Great in it. He was great in it, and I think reviving that terrible principal character and just really turning him into a bad dude who's sort of semi-zombified and wants to eat the kids. I mean, what an awesome way for Ferris Bueller for that whole thing to come full circle.
Yeah, I also thought it was funny that he had a fallout shelter in the school, but he was really the only one that got to use it. And none of the students got to, none of the other faculty. It was pretty much like, yeah, this is going to be mine.
Yep, that seems right.
There's a fun subplot here that I think could be kind of worth going into. At some point, we learn that Sam is being held by the jocks, and she's being tasked with like kind of an all-purpose knowing science person. She helps grow food for everybody, and she discovers that you can use sunflowers to clean up the radiation in the soil. So we do get a reference. There's radiation in the soil. It's not enough to make people sick, it seems, but it's enough to stop plants from growing. I guess the plants, if you eat them, then you would get sick. So she has this thing where she takes sunflowers to soak up the radiation from the soil, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Is that a real thing? Because it looks like it could be. I think it's something that you mentioned. Your favorite character, Mrs. Crumble. She teaches the kids this in school, which I think was really cool. It turns out this is true, although it would take upwards of 3 years for it to work. So I'm not a scientist or botanist, but according to the research that I saw, sunflowers are what they call, I think they mentioned in the show, hyperaccumulators. And these are plants that could absorb concentrations of like toxic chemicals, metals, other things that are in the soil. They can absorb that in their tissues and draw it out from the soil itself. Some scientists have said that if you will plant sunflower seeds in places where there's lots of this kind of toxic material, you can absorb it over the course of 3 years. There's some examples of in Fukushima, after 2011, the nuclear accident there. A chief monk at a Buddhist temple nearby started planting a bunch of sunflower seeds in order to be able to accomplish this task here. Let's see here. According to an article on the environmental website Inhabitant, at least 8 million sunflowers and 200,000 other plants were distributed by this Buddhist temple. So that's a pretty cool effort here, but not just from the science side. There's also a really cool connection between sunflower seeds and international nuclear disarmament movements. It's kind of become a part of the symbology of that effort. Would you like to talk a little bit about this? Because you may have worked with one of these organizations previously.
Yeah, absolutely. Sunflowers are seen as this international symbol for nuclear disarmament, sort of going way back to early days of the nuclear freeze fight. So this is a story that was written by an activist group called Waging Peace. This is now sunflowers carry new meaning. They've become the symbol of a world free of nuclear weapons. This came about after an extraordinary celebration in Ukraine achieving the status of a nuclear-free state. So on June 1st, 1996, Ukraine transferred to Russia for dismantlement the last of the 1900 nuclear warheads it had inherited from the former Soviet Union. Celebrating the occasion, a few days later, the defense ministers of Ukraine, Russia, and the US met at a former nuclear missile base in Ukraine that once housed 80 SS-19 missiles aimed at the US. The three defense ministers planted sunflowers and scattered sunflower seeds, and the Ukrainian president said, "With the completion of our task, Ukraine has demonstrated its support of a nuclear weapons-free world." And he called on other nations to follow Ukraine's path and to do everything to wipe nuclear weapons from the face of the earth as soon as possible. And U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry said sunflowers instead of missiles in the soil would ensure peace for future generations.
So that's really interesting, that there is that connection there. I'm not sure if the show was trying to draw on that, but it is a cool kind of bit of history there. I think that they were really just mostly drawing on the science side, but it's a fascinating thing if people wanted to kind of delve into that. It's really great. It's the same thing too. If people look at the symbol that you often associate with peace, that kind of an upside down fork that kind of spread out there, that is what original origins for this was in the kind of the civil disarmament movement. It was it CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. It was spelling out C, N, and D with the types of things you would do with flags on a ship when you're trying to signal to other ships. So it's an interesting connection of people who maybe like not know that the peace symbol has its roots in anti-nuclear movements, the same kind of stuff that you work on a day-to-day basis. So what do you think should be the next symbols here that we should be learning about and seeing in television for the next 30 or 40 years? You got anything on as cool as sunflowers or the peace symbol?
Can you beat sunflowers? I mean, I think sunflowers are so great because beyond everything that we've already said, sunflowers follow the sun. They literally seek out the source of light and aim themselves toward absorbing that and transferring it into something good, right? So like that is such a great symbol for everything that we're trying to do as change makers in addressing nuclear issues, but also just any problem that we have with society. So sunflowers are right on. I think maybe rainbows are the next thing, right? So that's sort of, for me, it's like you put a sunflower with a rainbow, and that's the perfect day.
That's a fun thing to find at the end of a rainbow. It's a nice sunflower patch. My sister had sunflowers growing outside of her window for a long time, and she had a high window, so she waited, I think it was about a year or two before they were finally tall enough to get up there. I never even knew that those would be good things in case we had radiation in the backyard. We can also clean that up, so that's great.
There you go.
So season 1 of the show, there's lots of little episodes here and there. There's lots of new characters that we meet. The different groups will fight against each other. There's all kinds of stuff, but the big ending point is that Baron Triumph, he gets revealed, he gets put in prison, he comes back out, he then takes over the jocks, and through his pure survival of the strongest kind of mentality, he gets back to being principal. He decides what he wants to do is take one of the undetonated nuclear missiles that landed in Glendale, which is for some reason is interesting because it looks basically like a missile as you would before you launched it. Somehow it launched itself and then like fell down and didn't explode. We have other episodes of our podcast where we talk about the fact that you send a missile up, it goes into space. The only thing that really lands on you as a unsuspecting citizen is something that looks like a large ice cream cone. The warhead itself, not the full missile, but okay. These are special missiles, right? These are somewhat of advanced kind of things. Yeah, but they have the missile, they have it propped up so that I guess refueled so that it could fire again. But anyways, they're trying to get that back, and it's up to Angelica and Mrs. Crumble to deal with the bomb. So it looks like Angelica has used her science skills to find a way to disarm the bomb. It looks like the bomb has both Russian and Chinese language characters on it. Anyways, I thought that was an interesting little subplot there. Baron he's defeated because they draw on the power of the ghoulies and kind of bring them in to fight him. The nut allergy comes back because, what is it? Is it Josh's samurai sword has dipped in peanut butter, and therefore the nut allergy gets to Baron Triumph because he gets cut on it. And the key thing at the end is there's this fun twist where you want to reveal the twist, I guess, for that would have set up season 2.
Yes, exactly. So Sam Dean, the supposedly angelic girlfriend that Josh has spent his entire season trying to save, turns out that instead of returning to romantic bliss with Josh, she's going to now rule Glendale, and there's an evil glint in her eye. So we find out that maybe she isn't the sweet girl we all hoped and dreamed she would be.
Oh no, she'll find a way to use sunflowers against us.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Anything else that I'm missing in terms of the different subplots? I guess Mrs. Crumble, she ends up saving the day because I guess she deals with the bomb. I think she tries to, I forget the exact thing that she does, but she basically is able to divert the bomb or to shut off the bomb, and she explodes, but then she comes back. So I guess she has that ability to come back.
I love that the adult who saves the day in this show, who doesn't save the day herself, really, but she saves the day by, one, empowering a kid, right? So she gets Angelica to feel like she can do it, and she makes her brave enough to go out, and it's really Angelica that's saving the day. And then Miss Crumble sacrifices herself. Like, what a great allegory for where we find ourselves today. It's, time to kind of step aside and let the kids do the business of fixing the world that we've destroyed, and give them the support and the help that they need to do that, but recognize that we've done a pretty bad job managing things.
So that's the show. There are some interesting kind of new plot discussion questions that I'd really love to get your takes on for some of these. So the first question is, if you were a teenager, or you can have this experience of actually watching this with a teenager, you're watching Daybreak without any sort of other nuclear background. So maybe this is not perfect for your kid, because I'm sure they would have gotten the nuke background spill yet. But if they didn't have that, what do you think that they might draw and take away from nuclear weapons, nuclear danger, from just, watching this? What does it say about nuclear war?
Yeah, so I think a couple things that are really important. One is the total collapse of society. That's the thing they got right. Even if the radiation part is not correct, and the distance from the detonation site, all that kind of stuff, those details are not right. Societal collapse, the fact that right now we have no hospitals, we have no emergency services, there's no electricity. I guess there is electricity somehow, but there are these things that we need on a daily basis that we just don't have access to, information and internet and things like that. So I feel like that's one really critical piece that tells teenagers the story of this is what happens in these kinds of destruction. This is a thing that's part of what nuclear war would look like. So that's one side of it, right? And I think that's super helpful. I think on the other side of it, though, you end up with kids kind of in charge in a sort of Lord of the Flies for the 21st century way that is hard, but also they have this sort of weird level of freedom. And I think, it's that watching them sort of decide, is this level of freedom worth not having the security of all those other things? And I think there is an interesting flow to that, right? Sometimes it seems worth it and sometimes it doesn't. And I think that's one of the reasons why having Angelica on the show is so great, because she's 10. And so she's so much more susceptible to those feelings of despair and stress and fear than some of the older kids are. And so I think it brings you, sort of grounds you back and like, oh no, actually all the parents are gone.
Yeah.
all of the people who would be there to keep them safe are gone, and that's going to have a negative impact on them.
Yeah, Wesley and Angelica were my two favorite characters. I think they played different aspects of what you want to cover in this scenario really well, kind of when you pair them together. So it was fun to kind of see their different plot lines be drawn out here. If you have the nuclear plot here, one of the second questions I had here is, do you think that the show could have worked without the nuclear plot? Because at least the comic book that it was originally based off of, I was able to find a copy of that online, and it's really just a zombie story. It's actually fascinating because the comic book is written, the whole thing is written in first person view, so it's you as the reader, as the person in this scenario. You never even speak, you just kind of run around with some other characters, and there's no nukes, there's no nothing. But when you introduce that nuclear plot to it, you do kind of get to a different kind of story. Of course, then you throw in all the fun Ferris Bueller's and Days Off and 80s references and high school stuff into it. You really do get a different show here that it wouldn't have existed if you didn't have the nuclear element here. What do you think the show would have been like if it didn't have that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that the nuke plot brings to it is the speed of destruction, right? So if you have just like a zombie, so take The Walking Dead, for example. It takes a really long time in The Walking Dead before the buildings are crumbling and all of the food is gone from the various places where they're sneaking in to find things, and they have to sort of turn the leaf over to how do we create a new society. Years, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in this show, you go from basically like regular society, destroyed society, Lord of the Flies society in a matter of weeks. And I think the only thing that allows that to happen is the fact that the nukes have destroyed not just the systems, right? It's not just like the fact that there aren't adults around anymore, but also all the infrastructure, all the information, all of the crops, like everything has sort of been taken out, which feels really important to the storyline, right? It would just be a much slower burn if that hadn't been the case.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you talked about the total collapse of civilization in the show and how well that portrays reality post-nuclear war. It's different even than the zombie stuff, because in the zombie you have the breakdown of people, and that causes problems. But in a post-nuclear war world, you have to concern yourself with other people who may be trying to, the war may still be ongoing. You have that conflict of people fighting over resources and what might be available. But then you also have simply the environment itself now is something that will try to kill you, whether it's destroyed ozone protection, so everything, you'll start losing your eyes because of the fact that UV rays will be higher, everything will be colder, crops won't grow, there's going to be no matter how many sunflowers you have, it won't grow if the sun is blocked out by nuclear winter. The different models that people have talked about here. So like literally the environment itself is trying to get you, which you don't normally get in a traditional, zombie movie. You only get concerned if someone bites you. Here it's, that would probably happen too, but it's because someone will try to eat you because there's no food left. There's all kinds of stuff. I would say that it does add a lot there that's a little bit different than we normally would get.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think whenever you have a show where kids are the stars, they're growing, right? I mean, I think you have to remember that from year to year, they're growing, right? So anything that takes more than a year is a long time in the life of the kid, and so you have to kind of speed things up. And unfortunately, nukes speed up the destruction, right? So having that as the sort of critical piece of what's causing this breakdown means that you've got kids that are sort of right at the beginning of the situation, and then they're having to deal with it, as opposed to sort of growing up in this situation and then dealing with it. So again, I think that speeding up of the destruction is a really critical piece that people need to understand about nukes, and this show does a good job of showing.
It does also try to show as well what could potentially cause this world to happen. There's a few in the first episode or two references to people tweeting nuclear war or the fact that it's adults that cause the problem and not the kids. But I think one of the things that this show does well is it doesn't try too much to explain what happened, because it's not so much every time. In some movies, it's really important. Even in Threads, it's a little bit of an importance, a sense of it kind of creates a realistic scenario that could lead to a conflict. But to most of the average people, particularly students and younger people, it doesn't really matter why. It just matters that it did, and it matters that it's affecting them. And I'm glad the show didn't try to lean too heavily into that. It makes reference, there's Chinese and Russian language on the bomb, but that's more of a mystery of what it is. Maybe they would explain it in a season 2 or a season 3, but it's also not that important. It's just that it happened.
Yeah, I like that it doesn't hit you over the head with some like geopolitical analysis, because, you know, teenagers growing up in Glendale are not going to have that. But I think it also does a great job of just sort of showcasing some of the geopolitical madness that's inherent in growing up right now, right? So some of those little examples, right, like the launching a nuke by tweet, that is such a given to kids at this point. Like that's kind of terrifying, right? And like that in and of itself is such an interesting statement about where we are in the grand scheme of history right now. That I thought that was really fascinating. And I thought the other thing that was great was how they sort of articulate a lot of that stuff in a really snarky, kind of cynical way, which again is so, you know, dead on when it comes to teenagers today who have been growing up in this world where, you know, adults clearly haven't cared enough to do something about climate change. Adults, you know, now these kids are starting to realize that nukes are an issue. Like, they are cynical because they feel like they've been handed a load of crap. It's an interesting way that this show has done a great job just sort of being snarky about it and kind of calling it as it is and not dwelling too much on hurt feelings about it.
It's not a nuke show, you know, in a sense. It's not like Jericho or some of these other kind of a show where most of the principal characters are teenagers, that involves around a nuclear conflict, that has more about that. This is a setup point. There's some really interesting themes that come out of it, but it's really more about the dynamics of the characters and all of that, which I think is great. But it leads me to our what I call the parking lot movie discussion. So it's when my friends and I, when we used to be able to go to the movies back in the day, right? The movie theaters. Yeah, such a long time ago, before the bombs. And we would discuss the movie in the parking lot afterwards before we went our separate ways. So I wanted to ask you, what did you think about the kind of semi-anthology format of the show? Very much, I like that particular piece to it. Do you think that now that we've kind of covered the full plot here, were there certain parts of it that you really enjoyed? Was there maybe a storyline you didn't love as much? Or I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that, because this is really a unique thing for a show.
I really loved that format. I mean, I think it gave you a sense of being able to understand the different characters in just really unique ways. I thought bringing in, for example, the samurai episode was such a departure. I was definitely not expecting it, and I think it showed me something about that character that I don't think we would have been able to see. Wesley ends up being this really very deep character, right? There are a lot of layers to the onion, and you wouldn't have seen that if it had stayed in the same format it had been in. So I thought that was a really great way of going about it. And I also thought that the fact that there was a through line of the tone, you know, the dark comedy and the sort of series of pop culture references to things from the 80s, but also more recently there were a lot of pop culture references outside of the Ferris Bueller ones. That was a through line. And so I thought that if they did a really good job of having like different types, you know, different formats, while also maintaining some of that consistency, so you weren't like totally thrown off episode to episode.
One of the things I was thinking about a lot when I would watch the show was what was a reference, what wasn't a reference, because a lot of this stuff went over my head. But it was fun because you got to understand for these characters, when they're that old, history and other things may have informed their thought process, but a lot of it was not. A lot of it's things they learned from their friends or from popular culture. It's kind of informing the decisions that they make. So it made me think about, for me, what was my favorite, teenage movie or comedy or TV show or things like that. I would love to know what yours was. Mine was a tie between, I was a big fan of the Wonder Years growing up. About an era way before I was born, but not too, fairly close in terms of when it was coming out. And then the movie Can Hardly Wait, which is completely non-nuclear or anything. But those two things, I wish there was a few more references to those stuff in Daybreak, but that kind of informed me growing up a lot in terms of how I would think about things. So if they were to make this show a couple years ago, I'm sure those things would have been more at the top of it. But any favorites for you? You'd love to talk about or recommend to people?
Yeah. I mean, my two favorites growing up were Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Great.
Right? So I was lucky because, one, Ferris Bueller's Day Off obviously very centrally played up in this show. But two, I think the sort of central message of the Breakfast Club around, like, you have these categories of people, but really all those categories are meaningless and we should come together, kumbaya, and so forth, is very central again to this show, right? The whole idea that they have all these different groups at the beginning that end up having to sort of unite in a coalition to solve the problems at the end is a restating of the Breakfast Club theme. I feel like the song may have been there at some point as well. And then I think just coming back to Ferris Bueller, I mean, I think one of the things that the reason that I love that movie so much is that I think it's such a great piece of evidence in the idea that you don't have to be good at school, or you don't have to be, tied to what the opinions of authorities are in order to be smart and effective. And that, like, to me, that's the whole story of Ferris Bueller, is somebody who's not going to live by the rules, but still has a good heart, still is going to do good stuff, and is going to do interesting things, and probably do things that are way more interesting than most people are going to do. And at the end of the day, Ferris Bueller is the guy in his future who created some great solutions to some really intractable problems in society. So to me, Ferris Bueller is like such a great example of the kind of like kids that I want to raise, knock on wood, if I can make it through the teenage years and then they can become like great people. To see that featured so centrally in a movie about what do we do after the apocalypse is like, yes, that's exactly the kind of energy you need, is the energy that says, well, screw what the status quo says, let me figure it out for myself and find a new way.
Well, just be on the extra lookout in case they decide that when they say, oh, I'm sick today, I don't know if I got a fever. Yeah, they may be pretending to be, what is it, Abe Froman, the Sausage King of Chicago? If the show wasn't canceled, because I think it was fascinating when we this has been an episode that's been a long time coming. When we watched it initially, I don't think it was canceled. And then since we watched it and getting ready for this episode, it was canceled. What would be some plot points, either nuke-wise or not, maybe one of each, that you really wanted to see in season 2?
Okay, so let me start by saying I'm actually really glad it was canceled, which is sacrilegious, but here's why. I think that very often shows like this, particularly these post-apocalyptic shows, kind of go on for too long, and then they start getting into all kinds of other plot lines that just divert from the energy and the sort of meaning of why they exist in the first place. So I'm actually glad to have this like one season encapsulated, and we don't have to worry about that happening. Okay, so that out of the way. If, though, we had a season 2, I think a couple things I would love to learn more about are what happens with Angelica. Again, she's one of my favorite characters. She's smart and quirky and super weird, but also a kid and has, carries all of the kind of emotional challenges that come with being a kid in this ridiculous world. So I think that I would love to see that, including, what's going on with her mom. I think that there was a little bit of foreshadowing that maybe her mom was still around in the submarine and there was something going on there. And
did it seem like a research submarine or a nuclear submarine? I couldn't tell.
Right? Right? So, like, I think maybe her mom was involved in some way in all this stuff that went down. So that one would definitely be, that's a storyline I'd love to see. And I think that that's where the tie-in is between maybe the nuke storyline and the rest of it, right? Is like, what is the sort of backstory of how this nuclear war started, and the truth that nuclear wars are started by people. Like, I think we tend to think of them as started by countries, and countries are run by people, and so this idea that it could have been her mom that was responsible for that is a really interesting thread that I think should be pulled at. Let's see, what does it look like when someone you actually know is responsible for this kind of destruction?
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen that. Plus, let's say Sam, in her new world order she's trying to create that's different than Baron Triumph's, but it's got similar themes to it. What if she goes from Glendale to, I guess maybe the nearest place would be probably a couple Air Force bases, but let's say she goes to a missile field somewhere or a stockpile, and she gets access to a bunch of nuclear weapons, and the question for her is, what is she going to do with them? Is she going to get rid of them? Is she going to keep her sunflower philosophy of changing things for the better? Or will she fall into the temptation of the same one that the adults did? And then having Angelica and going through that same kind of issue with her and her family would have been maybe somewhat of an interesting storyline for the future.
For sure.
Let's see, wrap up of the discussion here. We always like to rate our stuff that we cover from a consistent 1 to 5 scale, with 1 being the worst and 5 being terrific. I like to keep that consistent because we can compare it across all the things we talk about, but I like to get super critical and tailor the rating system based on the plot that we watched. So I've crunched the numbers here. So for Daybreak, let's rate the show on a 1 to 5 scale of the number of sunflower petals when you're trying to make a really difficult decision. You know, picture the girl in that LBJ ad, the Daisy ad, a little girl picking flower petals as a nuclear launch countdown ticks away, and then she has just one, left and it explodes. So let's say in this scenario you have only one sunflower petal. That's not really great, because when you pick that one petal, you're done. But let's say you have 5 petals. Maybe you count real slow and you can get to your fallout shelter in your local high school. How many would you give the show? How many sunflower petals?
So I'm kind of torn on this. So like you said, we started watching this a long time ago, and kind of preparing for it. And I've watched it again recently to prepare for this conversation a couple months after I watched it the first time, and it doesn't really survive as well the second time around. I think some of the novelty of, the pop culture references and the snarkiness and things like that doesn't necessarily, entertain as well the second time around. And that's always something I'm looking for in the show like this, is the bingeability and the re-bingeability, right? So there's that. That being said, I think, they, for all the reasons that we just talked about, it was interesting and it was creative, and they did a good job of showcasing the characters and kind of talking about some of these big social issues in the context of this smaller Lord of the Flies community. And so on the balance, I would say probably 3 sunflower petals.
Okay.
Depending on the day you catch me, it might go down just a skosh.
How many would would your daughter, the older one, give it? Would you say?
I think she probably would have given it like 1.5. She really didn't like it.
Ooh, okay. I'm in a similar place as you. I give it 2.5. I'm allowed. Sorry, I forgot to mention you can do halves if you want to. So I give it 2.5. So that one is maybe that sunflower petal was already chewed off a little bit by a caterpillar or something. So I give it 2.5. There were some episodes I really liked, like the one with Riza, and I enjoy the smaller scale aspect of the nuclear story at points. But I'm just not the right target audience. But I'm glad to have seen it, because I need to see what people are consuming when I'm trying to make sense of nuclear pop culture. It was really fun to see Matthew Broderick do what he was doing, to see Wesley and his character do what he was doing. I do also thought that the comic book was interesting too. It's completely different. You would not understand if you watch those two things at the same time. It's completely different. It was fascinating because the guy who made that, Brian Ralph, he said he was inspired by Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is one of my absolute favorite books. Before my child was born, I listened to it again. I try to do it at least once a year. I listen to that because it's not a very happy book at all. It's very depressing about, we don't know what environmental or nuclear or something happened, but the world is all burnt up, and it's a man and his son trying to go south to get to the ocean where maybe there'll be life and it might be a little bit warmer. But it's one of these great bits of post-apocalyptic fiction that I really enjoy. And then I think the Netflix people who did the show were right to add some of the more fun elements into the show. So that was fascinating to kind of see all of that. It's still, maybe I'm just not the right audience for it, but there were aspects that I enjoyed enough. So 2.5 is pretty good. I've had stuff that we've covered on this podcast before where it's a 1 and I never want to touch it again or thinking about it again. This is not one of those. I'm happy to talk to people about it in the future. But if there are things we would recommend to people check out instead of this, or maybe in addition to this would be things, whether they are nuclear or related to Daybreak or just something maybe in the genre that you might like. I have 3 things, but I'll let you go first. You're the guest. What would you recommend to people to check out?
Okay, the first one is The 100. I don't know, you probably covered The 100 before, but if you
No, it's on my list though.
All right, well, you should cover The 100. So this is a show where the kids are actually kicking ass, right? Like, they are Lord of the Fliesing their way through this post-apocalyptic hellscape, and they are not Ferris Buellering it. Like, they're serious, they're war painting themselves, and they're definitely not a comedy. If you're looking for something with youth kicking ass, that's your go-to. Okay, so that's the first one. My second is going to sound kind of crazy, and it's not nukes related, but it's Phineas and Ferb. So this is, if you're not familiar with Phineas and Ferb, it's a cartoon, and it's essentially it's these 2 kids who are just like hyper geniuses and are inventing all kinds of like crazy innovative ways to have fun or solve problems, wise beyond their years, but always getting away with it, and the adults are none the wiser. And it's just a great way to be inspired about the like potential and energy of kids that I feel like we don't put enough value in. So those are 2 about youth who are trying to save the world, and then my third one, things you should check out if you did or even didn't enjoy the show, the Beyond the Bomb website, I have to put the plug in.
Oh yeah.
Come and join us, and we'll give you some actions that you can take, and you can become the hero of the nuclear story.
And before I get into my other stuff, I would second that, because it really does allow people a very good, easy, I mean, not easy, but easy relative to being able to destroy all the world's nuclear bombs. It's a good way for people to be able to themselves have agency and at least feel better about the world and their connection to nuclear weapons. Because it only will, at any point in history, it's only seen progress being made on this stuff when people and citizens talk and say that they want this to be something, and then vote that way, or can convince the people that are already there. My three things are a mix of stuff. WarGames is something I always recommend it, because simply Matthew Broderick's in it. So it's fun there. We covered that one on the podcast. I wish I can go back. I think it was the second or third episode we did, and I didn't know what I was doing back then with the podcast. But now I would love to go back and talk about it some more. I recommend this movie called The Night of the Comet from 1984. Have you ever heard of this one?
I haven't.
This was a movie that I saw when I was a kid on TV. I probably should not have seen it, because it's a little bit closer to an R than a PG-13. But I forgot what the title of this movie was for 15 years, and finally Googled just the right combination of words and figured it out. But it's a movie where there's a comet that either turns people into dust or zombies. You sound a little familiar. And it's where there are a few teenagers that were saved because they were making out in a movie theater projection booth that was surrounded by lead. And apparently that was what protected them. They need to navigate this new crazy world, find their friends, find a cure. It's not the most amazing movie when I watched it recently, but it's fun. It's a lot of fun, and it's partially as well was the inspiration for the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie, which then became the show, which is very popular. Recommend people check that out as well. And then finally, an article that was written by Elizabeth King in the publication called TheCut. It's from 2017 in June, called How Growing Up with the Threat of Nuclear War Shapes Kids' Psyches. And she cites a number of studies of kids who lived up during the Cold War and how the ever-present threat of nuclear war impacted their lives and development. So it's particularly interesting for all of this, for the kids in Daybreak who grew up with the concern and then had to grow up with even further with the actual issue itself. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast here. Where can people find, other than the website Beyond the Bomb, where can people find some more of your great insights on all this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So check us out, beyondthebomb.org, or on Twitter at beyondthebomb. And I am on Twitter at Cecili TW. That's CECILITW. You can check out all kinds of great analysis that we have on our blog, including some good analysis of other pop culture instances, or just us ranting about the woes of the world and how we're going to fix them.
Great. Any big 2020 goals other than come out of quarantine and save the world? Like any other big projects people should be looking out for, or maybe a particular effort that may be now inspired to help out on?
Yeah. So in June, we have a online lobby visit set up. So you can lobby your representatives. We have a piece of legislation in Congress on no first use. We talked about that at the top of the show. No first use is our primary policy goal. So you can lobby your representatives and get them to co-sponsor that legislation. So that's in June that we're doing an at-home lobby. We know everybody is again stuck in their little hobbit holes. So that is your opportunity to kind of stretch your activist legs without necessarily leaving the house. And then, if you go to our website and sign up, you'll get updates. We send out a monthly action alert that has updates on what we're doing, but also on what other movement partners are doing. And right now we have this super fun Twitter feed. Fun is maybe not the right word. It's called Bullshit Watch. And we are keeping track of all of the bullshit that is being blasted into the policy sphere in the midst of COVID, using COVID as a cover to pass bad policy, whether it's nuke related or not. So if you know of any bullshit, then send it our way, #BullshitWatch. That's
terrific. I promise not to use it to just complain about movies that I see with nuke imagery and things in them. I'll keep it to the important stuff. So thanks so very much again for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, or you want to tell us what we got wrong, nuke-wise, or maybe we weren't accurately representing what it's like to be a teenager, a couple ways you can contact the show. I am on Twitter for the show at Nuclear Podcast. I have a Gmail account that people send a lot of great comments to, and I love responding to people on that, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. And we're also on Facebook and some of the other usual places you can find shows and things like this. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Cecili Thompson-Williams.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we're bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.